Hello, I'm Dr. Sarah Spooner and I'm a Senior Lecturer in Landscape History at the University of East Anglia. We've been working with Norfolk County Council to develop short circular walks around Greater Norwich, and this film introduces 3 of them in the north and the west of the city. This is the definitive map of public rights-of-way in Norfolk, which shows all the footpaths, bridleways and byways in existence. There are lots of interesting patterns here, a dense concentration of footpaths in the south and the east, and far fewer in the north and the west, for various historical reasons. Norwich represents a bit of a gap in the map here. If you know where to look for Norwich, you'll see there are not many footpaths in and around the city. If we add the roads on top of that map, then Norwich is a lot more obvious as this big orangey red splodge. You can also see the other urban centres in Norfolk really clearly here, as well as a big blank space in Breckland, which is the Stanter battle area where there are no public rights of way or roads at all. Let's zoom in on Norwich itself. Greater Norwich is far larger than the historic city centre, which you can see in the centre there, bounded by the red inner ring road, and which of course partly follows the course of the medieval city walls. If we add the footpaths on top of that, then you can see in more detail that there is indeed a gap in the footpath network around Norwich, where there are no public rights of way, at least within the outer ring road. But is that pattern because of the extension of the built-up area? Were there historic footpaths in that part of the countryside around Norwich before the city expanded? If we go back in time to the 1880s on this Ordnance Survey map, then we can see that Norwich is beginning to expand over former open countryside, swallowing up little farms and hamlets as it grows. However, this was not an area which tended to have many footpaths anyway. Earlier paths which might have existed before parliamentary enclosure in the 18th and early 19th centuries had already gone by this point. There were very few within the area of what is now the inner ring road. As Norwich continued to expand throughout the interwar period in the 1920s and 30s, the expansion of the built-up area of the city meant that new routes were being created. New roads, tracks and paths linking together the new streets, open spaces and estates. Other, much older roads and tracks were being reused and helped to shape the new layout of these areas of Norwich. We have created a number of circular walking routes which explore the landscape history of the expansion of Norwich in this period. Each walk links together a number of green and open spaces, some of which have a long history, and also takes in housing of different dates and styles, as well as schools, pubs, churches and the River Wensum. We've looked particularly at the way that the pre-existing rural landscape has helped to shape the modern landscape of urban Norwich. Although these areas and these routes might be familiar to many of you, we hope that there will still be some surprising insights and that it might help to encourage more people to walk and explore the landscape history of the city. This film focuses on 3 of these routes: the Mile Cross Estate, shown here in dark blue, the area around Waterloo Park, which is shown here in dark red, and around Earlham Cemetery, highlighted here in pink. This is our first route, around Waterloo and Wensum Park. This photograph, taken by George Plunkett in 1933, was taken the day after the park officially opened. You can see how small the trees are and how new the planting looks. Here we have the route overlaid on a modern aerial photograph on the right, and on the left this area of the city in the 1880s, still largely open with some development around the edges. In the 1840s, this area was still almost entirely fields. There had been very little development outside the medieval city walls here. This is the tithe map of around 1840. The main roads which still structure the area are shown here: Aylsham Road, Waterloo Road and Angel Road. Their names change, their course changes slightly, but these have almost certainly structured the landscape here for centuries. As the population of Norwich began to expand in the 19th century, coupled with a change of emphasis in industrial wealth, from predominantly a textile-based industry to a more diverse range of industries such as boots and shoes, printing and so on, the city began to grow outside the medieval walls onto earlier farmland. This map shows us the area around Angel and Waterloo Roads in the 1880s, when there has been some development already in the top right-hand corner of the map, and the former farm, Chalk Farm, in the middle of these fields has become a large commercial nursery with lots of glass houses. If we fast forward 30 years to 1907, we can see the terraced streets begin to appear. These houses were lived in by skilled working-class families who worked in the boot and shoe industries as printers and compositors, carpenters and salesmen. From here they could easily walk to their place of work in the city, and the children who moved into these new houses went to school just up the road to the schools on Angel Road. Some people's place of work and the industries they worked in were right on the doorstep. Part of the walk goes down Rope Makers Walk off Drayton Road, which is shown here in 1884. Ropemakers Row and the pub, the Ropemakers Arms, are right next to an open space used as a rope walk, a long open space where the fibres for rope were laid out and twisted together. In the narrow row of cottages behind the Ropemakers pub, with their shared yard and communal pump, lived Robert Betts and his family, who are still listed as ropemakers here on the 1901 census. The rope walk was replaced in 1914 by the Edward and Holmes Shoe Factory. This aerial photograph from 1928 shows the huge factory, one of the largest in the city, which was designed for 1,000 workers. It also shows the small terraced houses of Ropemakers Row. Robert Betts no longer lived there by that point when the new factory was built. He lived a few streets away with his son, who worked as a boot and shoe clicker. These new terrace streets have pubs, shops and schools to support the new families living there. The walk takes in some of the historic pubs along the route. The other key piece of the landscape is open space for recreation and for leisure, and this walk links together two of Norwich's most well-known parks. Waterloo Park was created out of open fields among the terrace streets. It first opened as a recreation ground in 1904. Here it is on a map of 1907, when it had a bandstand, tennis courts, bowling greens and a school garden for the pupils at Angel Road School. It underwent a comprehensive redesign in the late 1920s by Captain Sandy Zwinch, the park superintendent for Norwich City Council, who redesigned many of the city's open spaces in this period. These photographs were taken the day after the official opening in April 1933 by George Plunkett, showing the new bandstand flanked by formal canals and ponds, and the children's playground and paddling pool, which was reputed to be one of the best in East Anglia. A few streets away, and right next to the Edward and Holmes factory, was Wensum Park, also a Sandy Zwinch design, and shown here in the 1880s when it was a meadow next to the River Wensum. This also has an early history, opening to the public as an open space and bathing place in the River Wensum in 1908. It was redesigned in 1924 with a circular pattern of walks, beds and fountains, and remodelled paddling and swimming pools dug into the riverbanks. This aerial photograph of 1928 shows the newly reopened park with its obviously new planting and its new pavilion in the middle of the picture. This first route then focuses very closely on late Victorian and Edwardian Norwich, its terraced houses and industries, and the Edwardian parks, which underwent a spectacular redesign in the 1920s. The second route moves south and west to the area around Earlham Road. This route takes the Victorian cemetery on Earlham Road as its starting point and goes on to explore the area on either side of Guardian Road, taking in 3 green spaces this time: the cemetery itself, Henderson's recreation ground and the Woodlands Park. The terraced housing on Earlham and Dereham Roads was the edge of the city in about 1900. This walk takes in some of those streets and also moves into areas which were built up in the interwar period and after the Second World War. The cemetery on Earlham Road is a well-known landmark. It was first opened in 1856 to replace the crowded city centre churchyards, and the first person to be buried in the cemetery was a labourer called James Baldry. He was killed when he fell from the scaffold during the construction of the mortuary chapels inside the cemetery itself. Nearby is another public open space, the Woodlands Park. This has been a wood since the early 1800s, but it hides the earthworks of a very large extraction pit, a typical feature of this part of the countryside around Norwich. You can see another extraction pit with lime kilns inside it, right next to the Woodlands Park on this Ordnance Survey map of 1907. It was purchased in the late 19th century by Robert Fitch, who lived in a large house called Woodlands on the other side of Dereham Road. He turned it into a woodland garden. And after he died, his daughter gave it to the city as a public park. Although the rustic shelter that you can see on this early postcard of the park has now gone, you can still find the gravestone of Fitch's dog, Punch, who died in 1885 and who is buried inside the wood. The other open space that this walk connects to is a very different one, Henderson's Recreation Ground, which was created after the Second World War when concern over public health and the need for recreation and open space in urban areas was high. This map shows the area in 1928 when it was being used as fields and allotments and a commercial nursery. This map from 1956 shows the newly created recreation ground. This was created by a private charitable trust, the Henderson Trust. It was and is notable for the large running track in the top right-hand corner. You can also see the new schools which have been built to go alongside the new houses on either side of this map. Henderson's recreation ground lies close to a road which was relatively new when it was created, Guardian Road, which was laid out across open fields in the early 1900s to provide a link between Bowthorpe Road and Dereham Road. This map of 1886 shows the landscape that existed here before Guardian Road was created, with a small wood in the centre. It will probably not be a surprise that that small wood disappears underneath the new road and the housing on either side. Guardian Road was built first. The houses were added in the 1920s and 30s, with a bit of post-war council housing filling in the gaps after the Second World War. The roundabout at the junction of Guardian Road, Dereham Road and Sweetbriar Road was added in the 1930s as traffic into and around the city began to increase. This photograph of the roundabout was taken in 1933 by George Plunkett, and those of you who know Norwich will know that this roundabout now looks very different. In this case, the pre-existing historic landscape has had relatively little influence on what was constructed in the 20th century, which tended to ignore the older patterns of the landscape. This route then links together these three open spaces of different dates, all connected by housing of different dates and different styles. The new road layout in the early 20th century has altered this part of the city in quite fundamental ways. It's a part of the city which is more often experienced in the car rather than on foot. Our final route focuses on the Mile Cross estate, which was laid out nearly a century ago. The look and feel of it is still very modern and fresh. This is a shorter walk which takes in the historic core of the Mile Cross estate, which was open farmland up until the 1920s when it was purchased by the City Council. The Ordnance Survey map on the left here shows the landscape in the 1880s when it was still rather featureless farmland with some small houses and pubs strung out along Aylsham Road. This is the most dramatic transformation in terms of the historic landscape from these fields to the curving, wide streets of the estate, which was directly inspired by the garden cities. Although many people in Norwich have been able to move into one of the comfortable terraced houses built in the 1890s and 1900s that we have seen on the other routes, there are still many families living in cramped and overcrowded conditions in the city centre. In 1919, a report carried out by the City Council found that there were 4,000 slum houses in Norwich, which was probably an underestimate. And in 1921, the City Council medical officer had serious concerns about the impact of overcrowding. The new estate at Mile Cross was very different to the courts and yards of Norwich that it replaced, with wide roads, wide grass verges, lots of tree planting and open space. This is Suckling Avenue, photographed in the late 1920s or early 1930s when the estate was still very new, showing the wide spaces between the houses. This aerial shot of 1932 also shows the sheer amount of space between the houses, which had generous front and back gardens and additional allotments provided in the blocks in between them. These have now largely been converted to garages. At the top of this image, you can see Mile Cross Gardens, which was designed as part of the grand entrance to the estate. These are also designed by Captain Sandys Winch, who designed many of the other parks in Norwich. They were designed as a pair of bowling greens, each with a concrete pavilion and covered walkways and pergolas. The pergolas have now gone, but the bases for the upright columns still remain in front of the pavilions. This photograph, taken from the top of St Catherine's Church Tower, looks out over the newly built houses and back gardens, already here full of sheds and vegetable beds. This particular image also shows us some of the open ground between the houses, which you can see on the left-hand side, which is crisscrossed by little paths and tracks created by the families living in these houses who use these open spaces as informal ways of accessing back gardens and other parts of the estate. This new community was provided with new schools, shops, pubs, a Sunday school, a library and a new church. This is St Catherine's, seen here in the mid-1930s under construction. In the corner of the churchyard at St Catherine's stands a special survivor, one of the few pieces of the pre-existing landscape to have survived in the modern landscape. This is an old hedgerow oak, partly pollarded at some time in its life, which has managed to survive the dramatic transformations which has taken place around it. It's one of the few pieces of relics countryside which dates from before the Mile Cross estate was created. Even somewhere which has had so many changes, we can still find the evidence of the landscape and the countryside which came before. That was just a short introduction to the landscape history of each of these routes. We hope that you enjoy exploring the interactive maps and hopefully walking them on the ground. We'd love to hear your feedback about the route.